right, hello everybody. This week we've been looking at responses to the Industrial Revolution, and I hope you've done your readings. If you haven't, you might want to stop this and do that first, because I would want to talk about those two readings and expand on those a little bit for you. So we read from Samuel Smiles, his text called Thrift, and we read from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' Communist Manifesto. And we're looking at these as two ways of looking at the problems that are created by the Industrial Revolution. Now, before I get into that, let's just briefly kind of review what they are responding to. And to do that, we might want to step back a week and check out the reading we did last week plus the video. The reading was also from Friedrich Engels. It was called The Conditions of the Working Class in England, where we pretty much saw a kind of anthropological view of what the working class living conditions were like at that time. And if you remember from that reading, it was pretty abysmal. Things were not going very well for the working class. Living conditions were pretty horrific. And if you don't remember, go back and check that out again. The video we watched that week was on child labor. And something I want you to remember about that is most of these families, they don't want their children going into factories. They don't want their children going into coal mines. They're pushed into this position, right? Remember, there's no minimum wage at this time. There's no oversight from the government on how many hours are being worked, etc. So to make ends meet, many of these families have to have every single person in the household occupied with employment. It's a very tragic situation. And that's what we're looking at here, is the conditions of the working class. How do people respond to that from these different perspectives? So I'll start with Samuel Smiles. He has a very interesting take on this from his text Thrift. And as I mentioned in the introduction on my website, he is very much focused on the individual, right? As opposed to looking at a kind of system-wide analysis, so to speak. He's not really analyzing capitalism as an economic system, right? He's saying this is the system you're in. You're being paid wages, and you basically need to have some self-control, people. Very much putting the impetus on the individual to save money, to better themselves, etc. And just to point out perspective on this, this is very much a middle class type of perspective on the working class. That's his background. He was a physician for a while, a doctor, a journalist, etc. And again, he's looking at this not from a kind of systems approach, not from even an economic analysis, so to speak, but simply saying you, the individual, are creating these problems for yourself, right? And he to quote from him, he says, even if you pay these folks more money, quote, it will only furnish him with increased means for indulging in the gratification of his grosser appetites. Right? So his economic analysis basically says it doesn't matter how much you pay these people, they're going to keep doing the same thing. Right? It is an individual moral failing, essentially, on the part of these folks. Okay? Now, Marx and Engels, on the other hand, take a different approach to this. Right? They're going to look at this from what they would call a materialist perspective, okay, or an economic approach, where they're looking at the system itself and trying to analyze what is causing this type of poverty and the conditions that these people are living in, right? And before I get into his solution to this, let's think about his analysis of it, right? And again, he's looking at this from an economic systems approach, right? He's trying to figure out how the system functions and if that is causing the problem, right? Rather than just focusing on these individuals, okay? And for Marx, the way he looks at this, he sees that there is a division between these social classes, the proletariat, or the working class, and the bourgeoisie, or the owning class, right? The people that own the factories. Okay, and the problems, according to Marx, arise from what he calls the surplus value of labor. Okay, and to explain that briefly, okay, and I'll try to use a kind of modern analogy for that. And we can think about this maybe from your own perspective as somebody who's going to be working maybe this year, maybe next year, right? Let's think about Baskin-Robbins, perhaps. Okay? Baskin-Robbins has a very high profit margin, meaning they make quite a bit of money as opposed to how much they pay for the raw materials and the labor that goes into it. Their profit margin is about 40%. Okay? So let's say you're working at Baskin-Robbins on a typical Friday night. Okay? You make $8 an hour. Okay? Somebody comes in, they buy $25 worth of ice cream for their family, plus a $10 cake to take home with them, right? So they've just spent $35. Okay? Well, if that's a 40% profit margin, then that means on that $35 sale, Baskin-Robbins has earned $14. Now that doesn't include your cost of labor, though, so you still have to subtract that. So you still have to take that $8 off of that. Okay? Now, if you're making $8 an hour, you're going to work about 5 hours that Friday evening. That's $40, right? Well, they need to generate at least $100 in sales during that 5-hour period to pay you what your wage is, right? Your $8 an hour. Okay? Anything over that is profit for them. Okay? So typical Friday night, that's pretty busy. Okay? That could be done in the first hour that you were there. That's very likely that would happen. Okay? Meaning the next 4 hours that you're working, you are generating profits for that company, for Baskin-Robbins, right? Because they've already settled with you during that first hour, right? If they've made that amount of sales, which again is very likely to happen. Right? That's where Marx would say the problem lies, in that there's an unequal distribution of wealth happening within this business model, right? Where most of the profit is going to what he called the bourgeoisie rather than the proletariat, who are the workers who are at Baskin-Robbins on that Friday night. Okay? And again, he would say it's not the fault of the worker as an individual, but the company itself, who is not sharing in those profits with their workers. Okay? Now, his response to that, right? What does he say should be done about it? Is again very different than what Smiles would say, right? Smiles saw this as kind of a moral problem of the working class, that if you could educate them on how to save money, how to be what he would call thrifty, right? That's the name of the document. Then they would be much better off. Right? Marx would say, well, that's impossible for these people. They just don't earn enough money to improve their material conditions. Right? And he says that is the nature of capitalism itself, is to squeeze as much profit as possible. And one of the ways you do that is by keeping the wages of workers low, right? That's one of the things that you can actually control in your cost of doing business, right? These other things, the machinery, the raw materials, those you're going to have to negotiate with someone else, right? With the workers, however, especially at this time period, you didn't have to negotiate with them, right? Unions weren't necessarily recognized, okay? So that is, kind of the key to profit margins during the industrial period, is the ability to pay these low wages, right, without any interference from the government through minimum wage or anything like that, without any interference from unions who are going to try to demand higher wages. Okay? And again, Marx would say that the only way that that's going to change is through a shift to a socialist society. Okay? because he would say inherently it is the nature of capitalism to, again, try to squeeze as much as they can out of the workers. And according to Marx, that will never change. Okay? And the only way that these workers are going to get full economic equality would be to basically overthrow the capitalist system itself, right? And institute a new system of socialism where there is no more bourgeoisie or owning class, right? You may have noticed in the Communist Manifesto he talks about the end of private property. That's what he's addressing there. When he talks about private property, he's talking about these businesses, okay, being the property of the bourgeoisie, as he would call them, right? The owning class of people. And when he discusses the end of private property, what he's saying is that should be turned over to the workers, right? Rather than being owned by one individual or a board of directors or whatever it may be in this capitalist model, right? And he does that in I believe in the second to last paragraph of the document that I gave you. Okay? And the last sentence there, he says it must be converted into a common property for use by all members of society. Right? This kind of collective community ownership of goods is what he's looking at. Okay? Again, very different analysis than someone like Samuel Smiles has, right? Who is very much placing capitalism kind of outside of his analysis, right? He's not really using the economic model itself to try to figure out an alternative way of structuring society, right? That's not what he's into. Smiles says, no, this is an individual thing, right? Capitalism is a system. In order to function properly inside of it, you need to change yourself as an individual, right? Whereas Marx would say, that's impossible. Okay? You can't necessarily reform capitalism. You can't make it better for the workers, right? You have to get rid of it and switch to something like socialism instead, okay? Where the means of production, the factories themselves, are controlled by the people who do the labor rather than the people who own the business, right? This is a very influential economic and social philosophy that comes out in the middle 1800s. Communist Manifesto was written in 1848. As you may know, in the next 100 years following that, you'll have a number of countries who will undergo socialist or communist revolutions. Soviet Union, right, in Russia. China, the dynastic cycle will fall, and then China will become communist for a period of time. Other places, Cuba, Vietnam, okay, North Korea, all at one point or another claim to be operating on these kind of socialist or communist principles. Okay? Now, people who consider themselves to be socialist and communist today will argue about that all day long, whether those were true models of socialism and communism. Nevertheless, they called themselves that, so we kind of have to take them at their word, right? That's what they were trying to attempt. Now, Marx and the Communist Manifesto is not the only kind of socialist response to this industrial revolution, to this new form of capitalism. There are other socialist thinkers, including what we would call anarchist thinkers, on what we call the left side of the political spectrum, who are, they share many of the same values as people like Marx, but have maybe some different approaches to get to this kind of socialist ideal that they're going for. Okay? For example, and I'll kind of end with this, traditional Marxist or traditional communist see a role for the state, right? They see the state in a capitalist society as perpetuating capitalism. Okay? Just like in a feudal society, the state perpetuated feudalism, right? Or in a slave-based economy, the state helped perpetuate slave-based economies. He would say that the state in its current function does that, right? The laws, everything are there to promote capitalism. And according to Marx, you could do the same thing with the state in terms of communism, right? It could be kind of a transitory tool to get to socialism. Okay? could use that to seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie, right? Um, that's what we saw happen in the Soviet Union. Okay? Now, Marx himself would say that eventually the state would wither away, and you wouldn't need it anymore because you would have this kind of economic equality in place. We did not see that happen in the Soviet Union. We did not see that happen in China. Okay? We never have seen that part of Marxist philosophy come to fruition. Okay? Anarchists, who are also very often associated with the left and socialism, would be against that step, right? They have the same end goal, which is a society that is run by the workers, but they don't see a need for the state there. They see the state as being just as problematic as the bourgeoisie or the business interest too, right? They don't. An anarchist is not in favor of any kind of overarching authority figure, so to speak. Okay? So, again, they have basically the same end goals, but kind of different perceptions on the role of the state in these transitions to socialism. Okay? Um, Now, I hope that was helpful to kind of walk through those with you. I'll try to do this more often. I'm trying to find some software where I can do video and show slides. It's kind of difficult for me to do on my Chromebook, so I'm working on that. Hopefully I'll be able to get that to you. But, all right, I hope everybody has a good day, and I will be speaking with you again.